be refurbished. It's 100 and something years old. It needs to be updated and dusted off. But when I was in Atwater, Kent, I also found this portrait of Stephen Smith. And when I saw this portrait of Stephen Smith, I became very interested because it was a portrait of a black man. And a portrait of a black man before the Civil War is a very rare thing. The majority of blacks prior to the Civil War were slaves. And they were kept on lists of the same thing as cattle, sheep, and a lot of them didn't have even last names. And to have a portrait of a black man, I knew it was very rare. But Atwater, Kent also said that it was painted by a black artist, which was extremely rare. Most everyone in colonial America was illiterate, white and black. To have a black individual not only sitting for the portrait, but painting the portrait, I found a very compelling thing. So that's how I really tripped across these, and I went on to a discovery, a historical discovery about it. So let me get back to this. Okay, I talked to Charles Janley Stilley. Let me talk about Christina for a minute before I get into the Stephen Smith. Christina was the Queen of Sweden. This was in when she took the crown. It was in the late 17th century. What had happened was, in Western Europe, everything was Catholic in Western Europe. England was Catholic, Sweden was Catholic, and this is in the medieval times, from 1000 to 1500. Then the Reformation started. Martin Luther had his protests, and he started the Reformation, and Protestantism occurred. It was a branch out from Catholicism. Well, the Catholics didn't like this, and a war started called the 30-Year War, and it really took place in Germany. And it was the most violent war up to that point in time in Western Europe. Most bloodshed occurred in that war. Well, the Catholics had the upper hand of it. They were winning. They were going to put down this, what they called a rebellion. They didn't call it a Reformation. They called it a rebellion. And the Catholics had the upper hand until this gentleman called Gustavus Adolphus came in from Sweden. He was kind of a warlord kind of guy. And he came into Germany and he turned the tide, and the 30-Year War then was settled. And that kind of was the division between Catholicism and Protestantism. But Gustavus Adolphus was killed in this battle. So his only heir was his daughter, 6-year-old Queen Christina. So in a way, Christina was the heir of Protestantism at this point in time. It's an inexact analogy, but she was kind of the Pope of Protestantism. She was her father saved it. So she was more than just a queen. She was kind of a major figurehead in terms of Protestantism. Well, she ruled Sweden. She was the Queen of Sweden until she was 28 years old. She left the crown. She abdicated and went to Italy and converted to Catholicism. So she's a very contentious figure. The fact that she left the crown wasn't a crisis because royalty and nobility changed in Europe at times. But when she converted, that sent shockwaves throughout Western Europe. It would be almost the analogy today of the Pope resigning and converting to Islam. You know, it would send a shock through Catholicism if something like that happened. That's kind of what happened with Christina. Well, when Charles Janley Stilley is accepting this portrait in 1876, and the speech is in the book, you can read the speech, he talks about a Protestant vision of America. You have to understand, you're going back to 12 years after the Civil War. The country was ripped apart. It's redefining itself. And Charles Janley Stilley, his ancestor was Olaf Stilley, one of these New Sweden settlers. So he has a stake in the history of the nation, and the nation's changing. You know, Irish Catholics are pouring into Pennsylvania. The Catholic-Protestant conflict is occurring here in Pennsylvania. And Charles Janley Stilley, his speech, he talks about America being this vestige for Protestants, that America was a gift to Protestantism. It was kind of, this is his speech, I'm paraphrasing it, you can see it in the book. But he's saying, in Europe, Catholicism had already existed, so Protestantism is, there's always going to be a conflict in Europe between what was and what is. But here in the New World, in America, in this New World, it's a gift, God gave America to the Protestants. I mean, I'm sure the, Native Americans had a different take on it, and so did the Catholics, But this speech he's talking about the Protestant stake in America. And it's an interesting view to see the Protestant ascendancy and how America was formed. So the speech is in the book, and this Catholic-Protestant divide is a part of the whole Christina story. The portrait also was painted by a gentleman by the name of David Beck, who came out of the Netherlands, and he was a Protestant also. But he was taught French in a French-speaking school. And in this divide in Europe, there are places like France, they're Catholic. Spain is Catholic. Italy is Catholic. Other places like England, that turned to be Protestant. Sweden turned to be Protestant. There's a divide. And David Beck is kind of in the middle of the divide too. His parents taught French, so he knows the French-Spanish thing, but he also is aware of the Protestant. He's born into a Dutch Reformed church. He goes up, he paints Queen Christina, and that's what this portrait is, David Beck's. It's actually a copy portrait of David Beck's. But David Beck leaves Sweden prior to Christina, and he kind of lays the groundwork for Christina's abdication. Because if people knew that she was going to convert to Catholicism, there would have been problems in Sweden. Being a Catholic was against the law at that point in time. A few were executed in Sweden. And same in Catholic lands. Being a Protestant was against the law, So she had to be careful, and she kind of used David Beck to lay the groundwork. David Beck ends up in Italy before Christina does. And he's on Christina's payroll during this whole time. So it's a kind of an interesting, and the book talks about David Beck's work with Christina. And I put forward the plausible theory that he laid the groundwork for her. And there's I'm limited on time here. I want to get to Stephen Smith. But it's an interesting thing about what played out in Europe between this Catholic-Protestant struggle. But to get into the Stephen Smith part, the portrait of Stephen Smith, when I investigated him, he's a real national hero. He's very understated. Stephen Smith was the richest black man in America in the 19th century. And what happened, he was born in Maryland, in this area just over the border, Cecil County, Maryland. And he was born onto a plantation as a slave. He was biracial. His father was white. We don't know who his father was. His mother was Nancy, was her name, Nancy Smith. And at the age of 5 years old, he is sold into Columbia, Pennsylvania, which is just south of Harrisburg, to a gentleman by the name of Thomas Bowd, who was a Revolutionary War hero. And he works on Thomas Bowd's lumber yard for a few years, but when he becomes 18 years old, the first thing he does is he buys his freedom. And he gets into the lumber business. And then he kind of gets into the coal business. And coal at that time is kind of like oil is today. And he becomes very wealthy. And Stephen Smith is living right on this border because Maryland is a slave state, Pennsylvania is a free state. And what Stephen Smith does is he starts helping runaways. Hundreds of them. He hides them in rail cars. And they go from Columbia, Harrisburg, here to Philadelphia. And a man by the name of William Still gets them here in Philadelphia and transports these runaways further north. So Stephen Smith, he's kind of at the crux of this, again, conflict, another free slave kind of conflict. And to live in it, to talk about it is one thing, to live in it is another. The analogy I draw and talk about is, we can talk about democratic values here and how